Hello, happy Friday. Today we are going to review all of the cycles that we've been talking about this week, talk about one more nutrient cycle and kind of pull all of this together. We've been talking throughout this unit about the elements that build the molecules that make up living things. And so you remember last week we talked about the Schnapps elements and how they build carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, and how important all of those molecules are in living things. All of those Schnapps elements move through these biogeochemical cycles. So far this week, we've talked about carbon and nitrogen. So we'll start by reviewing those two. We're also going to talk a little bit about the phosphorus cycle, and then we'll look at kind of how all these cycles are similar, and how they are biogeochemical cycles, how all those different pieces interact. So let's get started. The first one we're going to talk about today is the carbon cycle. And I'm going to do some drawing today as I go through and diagram and explain these cycles. These are things that you should be writing down in your notes. So make sure that you have a notebook and something to write with as we start going through and talking about these cycles today. So we're going to start with the carbon cycle, which is the first one that we talked about this week. So to start with, I'm just going to set up my picture here. I am going to draw some land, and we'll need some water. All of these nutrients that we talk about cycle in water in aquatic ecosystems, as well as on land. We tend to focus on the land part, but it's important to remember this happens in water as well, just like you saw in the fish tank yesterday. Now, you know that a lot of carbon dioxide exists in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, CO2. So we're going to put that in here first. Living things need carbon for a lot of reasons. All of the organic molecules have carbon in them, right? The word organic molecule means that it contains carbon. And some living things can get that carbon from the atmosphere. Remember when we learned about the carbon cycle, we kind of talked about it in like the short version of the cycle and the longer version. So we'll start by kind of diagramming how carbon moves through living things. So the types of living things that can take this directly out of the air and use that carbon dioxide directly are plants and other things that do photosynthesis. So they take in that CO2, they use it for the process of photosynthesis. And this is one of those chemical reactions where they break apart the carbon and the oxygen, and then they put those atoms back together with some other things in the form of this molecule called glucose, C6H12O6. You can see the C is your carbon in there. And that's a carbohydrate, that's a type of sugar that stores that energy. From there, that glucose then moves up the food chain into an herbivore. Here's my really fancy drawing. Let's see if you can tell what that is. There you go. And we get our carbon from the things that we eat, and we break it down and we use that to build all of our organic molecules as well. And then as we process that energy, we breathe out and release that back to the air through a process called respiration. Plants actually also respire and release some of it through the process of respiration as well. So that happens. So that's kind of that really quick cycle that we talked about. Plants take it in and use carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, and then it moves up through the food chain, and then all living things breathe it out as their cells carry out the process of cellular respiration. There is, of course, a longer cycle that can happen that stores away this carbon for extended periods of time. So we're going to add a little more to our cycle here. One of the things that can happen is when living things die, they decompose. which releases a lot of nutrients into the soil. And some of the soil bacteria take that carbon, and they also do that process of respiration we were talking about, and some of that is released by bacteria back up into the atmosphere as well. Some of this carbon dioxide, if you remember from the video Lethal Seas, we talked a lot about carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the ocean. The ocean can store carbon for a long time because it's so big. So some of the carbon gets dissolved in there. Some of that carbon in the water gets taken up by living things. And this part is similar to what we already drew. Producers in the ocean use the carbon dioxide from the water. It moves up through the food chain. But living things in the sea also incorporate it into their shells and their skeletons, those things that we learned about in Lethal Seas. And sometimes when those living things die, their shells and skeletons fall and can actually lock that carbon away in certain types of rocks like limestone. And then the carbon stays locked away down there for a long time. It can be released through volcanic activity and other types of geological processes like that. The other thing that can happen is when living things die, if they die under just the correct circumstances, some of their remains can become part of these things that we call fossil fuels. And that can be things like coal and oil and natural gas. And carbon can be stored in fossil fuels also for a long, long time, for hundreds, thousands, millions of years. And that carbon locked in those fossil fuels can be released if we dig it up. And here's my little factory, there's a smokestack, here's a door. If we burn that fossil fuel, we release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So that's kind of your overview of the carbon cycle. And like we said, this element is really central to all of the organic molecules. Carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids all contain carbon. Next, we're going to move on to the nitrogen cycle, which is the one that you looked at yesterday in a fish tank. And kind of looked at how that works in that little mini ecosystem. So first of all, if you remember our cho-cho-chan-chump, the two types of organic molecules that contain nitrogen are proteins and nucleic acids. So this is an important building block for those two types of processes. So nitrogen, lots and lots of nitrogen exists as a gas in the atmosphere. About 80% of the air that we breathe is actually made up of nitrogen gas, but we can't use that nitrogen gas. We breathe it in, our bodies can't break it down, and so we just breathe it back out. One of the really important parts of this cycle is the role of bacteria, because the only thing that can really directly take nitrogen out of the atmosphere are certain species of bacteria. For this cycle, we're not going to diagram the water part, but remember all of these cycles occur in water the same way that they do on land, like you saw yesterday. But we're only going to draw this one on the land just to keep our diagram a little bit simpler. I actually need to move the ground up here a little. Hang on. So bacteria are really central to this process. So the nitrogen in the atmosphere can be taken out by certain species of bacteria that do a process called nitrogen fixation. So I'm going to draw some little bacteria in here. And they do this process called nitrogen fixation. And that word basically means they make the nitrogen usable or available for other living things. And so they take that nitrogen from the atmosphere, they do this chemical process, and then they release it into the soil. As you saw yesterday, there are several different types of nitrogen that can exist in the soil in different chemical forms. There's that NH4+, that's ammonia. There's the nitrates and the nitrites that you learned about. For today, we're just going to summarize all of those. And remember, Remember, there are other types of bacteria within the soil that can convert one to the next, and there's all kinds of chemical reactions happening in here to convert those types of nitrogen from one to the other in the soil. So those are other roles of bacteria in this cycle, is to change some of those. And then once the nitrogen is in the soil, it can then be taken up by our plants that can use it to build their proteins and use it to build their nucleic acids. And from there, of course, it can move up the food chain. We get our nitrogen also from the food that we eat. So here's my lovely deer again. There we go. And also, again, when these living things die and decompose, a lot of decomposition also involves action of bacteria, and they release some of that nitrogen back into the soil. So there's one more piece that we need to add in here to kind of complete our cycle, and that's we need to get nitrogen back into the atmosphere. And once again, bacteria play a critical role here. So the only things that can release nitrogen back into the atmosphere are a different type of bacteria. Remember, there are zillions of different species of bacteria that all perform different things, and they have different chemical reactions that they use. So even though we mentioned bacteria several times in here, they're not all the same type. These bacteria do a different process called denitrification that releases the nitrogen back into the atmosphere as a gas, in that N2 form. So that kind of completes the cycle. So you can see bacteria are really important in how the nitrogen cycle works. The third one, which we haven't talked about quite yet, is the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is another one of the Schnapps elements that we haven't talked about quite as much. Phosphorus is an important part of nucleic acids. It's also really important in ATP, which you might remember is the energy molecule of cells. It's what powers active transport. That's when we talked about it before, and we'll be talking about it again really soon. It's also a component of your bones and your teeth. The unique thing about phosphorus is that it is never in the air. There is not a form of phosphorus that exists as a gas, which actually makes this cycle pretty simple. I'm just going to draw myself a little hill there. I will put some water in this one. And we'll just make a note here so you remember that this also happens in the water, just so that you always remember these cycles are happening in aquatic ecosystems too. But a lot of phosphorus is stored in rocks and minerals. And as those rocks go through the process of erosion, as they get worn away by wind and water, that releases the phosphorus into the soil. And once that phosphorus is part of the soil, then it can get taken up by plants. There's our plant. You might be able to guess what happens next. Our plants get eaten by, you guessed it, a deer. You should have drawn some, I should have drawn a rabbit or something this time. And again, when those living things die and decompose, that releases nutrients back into the soil. And sometimes that soil can also get compressed and be turned back into those phosphorus-containing rocks. So the phosphorus cycle is a little bit simpler simply because that phosphorus is never present in the atmosphere. So those are the three main nutrient cycles that we're talking about in this unit. Other nutrients do also go through cycles, but these are the three main ones that we're learning about in this unit. And if we look at them all together, I want you to take a minute and notice what parts of these cycles are similar. You can look back at the diagrams you drew in your notes as well. What did you draw that was the same in all three of these? Hopefully you noticed that the food chain is part of every single one of these. We had our plant being eaten by a deer in every one of the pictures I drew. Here there's a rabbit eating a plant, and you can see there are animals that eat plants in all of these. All of these nutrients move up through the food chain, and consumers get their nutrients from the food that they eat. Another part that's common to all of them is the process of decomposition. In all of these, when living things die and decompose, those nutrients are released back into the soil. And a lot of decomposition happens through the action of bacteria. So there's some bacteria in all of these. Can you identify one unique thing about each of these cycles? We talked about these as we went through the notes. But in the carbon cycle, we have that idea of kind of a short cycle with photosynthesis and cellular respiration. That part of the carbon cycle will actually be our topic next week, is to learn more about those processes. And then those longer places where it can get stored away. With nitrogen, we talked specifically about how important bacteria are in that process of nitrogen fixation, taking it out of the air. And in the phosphorus cycle, we talked about how it's never in the air. So that's a unique thing about that one. And in a real ecosystem, it's also important to realize all of these are happening all the time. So this diagram has little pieces of all three cycles happening at once. See if you can look at this and find a little bit of the nitrogen cycle, a little bit of the phosphorus cycle, a little bit of carbon cycle, a little bit of water cycle. They're all in there, and they're all happening at the same time. Also, go back and think about that word. We call these biogeochemical cycles. So think about the role of living things, the role of earth or soil or rocks, that's the geo part, and some of the chemical changes that happen. We are going to continue talking about these cycles as we move into the last part of this unit, specifically the photosynthesis and respiration part of the carbon cycle. That's what we will be looking at next week. For today, you have an assignment that's going to ask you to review these cycles and the notes that you took today and answer some questions to make sure that you understand everything that we have learned. So I hope you have a great weekend and contact your teacher if you have any questions today.